Hi everyone, welcome back to this talk series about the new MA Internet Equalities course which is launching at the Creative Computing Institute in October. This week we're going to focus on the Human Rights and Computation unit, and we're very lucky to have Azmina Dhrodia with us to do that. So I will introduce Azmina, give you an overview of the unit. She and I will have a discussion, and then it'll be your chance to ask any questions. Feel free to also drop questions into the chat as we go along. So let me introduce you now to the wonderful Azmina. She's an expert on online gender-based violence against women with a particular focus on social media content moderation, freedom of expression, and online safety. She was most recently the head of operations and research at Block Party, which is a new tech startup that solves online harassment by giving people greater control over their communications online. Previously, she was a research and policy advisor on technology and human rights at Amnesty International, and she spearheaded the work on research, policy and advocacy on violence and abuse against women online. She's authored several reports and articles on the issues, including the cutting-edge report Toxic Twitter Violence Against Women Online, where she applied an intersectional lens to analyse the human rights impact of abuse against women on social media platforms. So as you can see, she has an amazing profile and a wide range of experience working in the human rights space. So a big thank you, Azmina, for joining us today. So to talk about the unit now, it's the longest one on the course. It runs over 20 weeks, and it was designed that way because this is a huge topic with a lot to cover. In 2018, the UN Human Rights Council adopted a resolution affirming that the same human rights people have offline must be protected online. But it's clear that this is not always the case, so the focus of this unit is on the relationship between human rights and the internet. And we'll be exploring the roles of technology companies, governments, regulators, civil society and the law in protecting human rights online. Students will also be looking at online human rights violations. So, for example, online harassment violates the human right to safety, to be free from discrimination, and to participate meaningfully in public debate. It can, of course, also violate people's right to privacy. We'll be looking at internet legislation and regulation. So this is about digging into some really challenging debates about how the internet is and should be managed and regulated. One key debate is around content moderation. So how should companies, governments and the law deal with harmful content and its removal whilst also protecting free speech? We'll consider debates around data protection and privacy, from the EU's General Data Protection Regulation to the collection of conversation data through personal assistants like Alexa and the regulation of facial recognition systems. Students will also explore how artists, activists and civil society have developed countermeasures to tackle human rights violations in online spaces. The unit will be delivered through lectures and seminars, critiques and visits, class-based workshops and assignments, group work, peer learning and also knowledge exchange. So again, students will be testing some of what they've learned in class through independent practice and through their writing. In terms of learning outcomes, students will firstly synthesize and critically analyze debates around internet regulation and governance. So this is about bringing together and critiquing various readings and discussions and finding a position for yourself through close reading and analysis. They'll evaluate and assess the efficacy of a range of actions for tackling online harms. So this is about saying, okay, what has worked, what hasn't been effective, and what are we drawn to in terms of activist or creative practices. They'll produce a practical intervention to advocate for the protection of online rights. So this is quite an open brief, but again, it's about students responding to their learning through practice by proposing an intervention. It could be a campaign, a petition, a creative project, or something else. And finally, they'll communicate the intentions, contexts, sources, and arguments for their experimental work. So this is about developing as really strong communicators who are able to articulate why the things they make or do are important and how they can make a difference. There are some really interesting texts on the reading list for this unit, so I'll share just a few of them. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is obviously a milestone document in the history of human rights. It set out in 1948 for the first time fundamental rights to be universally protected, and it's been translated into over 500 languages since then. Speech Police, the Global Struggle to Govern the Internet, is by David Kay, who's the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression. And it's really an exploration of the debate I touched on earlier around how to maintain the internet's original commitment to free speech, free of corporate or government control, whilst also finding ways to regulate its worst aspects. Hate Crime in Cyberspace by Danielle Keats-Citron is an in-depth look at online harassment, which she sees as a matter of civil rights law, arguing that we must leverage legal precedents as well as social norms of decency and civility in order to stop it. So that's all I'm going to say for now. I'm very happy to now get into the conversation a bit more with Azmina.
So hi everyone, thank you very much for joining us. We're not live, but you can drop questions into the chat below and we'll respond to those. And you can also email the CCI if you have any questions about the course. I'll give some more information at the end of our discussion around how you can apply as well. So thanks again for being here. Azmina, thank you so much for being here. It's really great to see you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I just would love to start with asking you to say why you think a human rights-centered approach to technology development is valuable.
Yeah, I think a human rights-centered approach is valuable because what it essentially does is it provides a framework that allows any of the technology that we're building and technology companies more broadly to ensure that whatever they're building and whatever they're doing is respecting human rights. So it gives them a framework to consider things like, is what I'm building, respecting the right to non-discrimination? Is what I'm building respecting the right to equality? Are there ways where what I'm building or what I'm producing is contributing to threats of violence against individuals? So essentially, what it does is it gives a framework to ensure that companies and the products and tools and the software that they're building respects human rights and ensures that there are specific responsibilities that they know that they should be abiding to. And it also holds them to account by ensuring that if any of the, if anything that they're doing or building is contributing to human rights, that they address it as a matter of importance, and they assess this regularly. So the UN standards on business and human rights, called the Ruggie Principles, explicitly, applies to all companies, but that includes technology companies. And it really just ensures that all companies are taking a step back whenever they're building and seeing how they contribute to human rights abuses, and if so, ensuring that they address those.
Do you feel like it's a framework that companies or other groups, organizations, governments, etc., respond to well because it's framed as being universal?
Yeah, I think that definitely helps. Just the universality of it, and just the fact that human rights are universally accepted as rights that everybody has. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is accepted by a declaration accepted by all governments. So I think it's really important that you have these standards and these frameworks in place, and they can very easily be and have been adapted to the responsibility of technology companies. And so it's not just. And I think what it does as well is it frames it, there's a lot of legal thinking and legal jurisprudence around sort of human rights and technology companies. It's a growing nascent field of thinking. But I think what has been shown by everything that's been sort of researched and done so far is that it's a tricky topic to cover for technology companies sometimes, how to respect human rights, what are the balances and what are the trade-offs in certain situations, particularly around free expression. And what human rights standards do is they provide a framework for that, which is just, it provides an answer or guidance or guidelines, which I think is extremely helpful when we're looking at really tricky subjects that we haven't really necessarily had to think of in this context before.
Amazing, thank you. So in framing the idea of human rights-centered design, They're also nodding to the discipline of human-centered design. And that discipline's been critiqued for overly generalizing about humans and not considering structures of inequality or unequal power relations. So when we center humans, what humans are we talking about? What rights do they already have? How are they oppressed? How are they in power, etc.? And I was wondering if you see a human rights approach as being helpful in trying to unpack some of those distinctions a bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important for us to consider all human rights. So when you're so if you're just looking at human rights in silos, so if you're just looking at freedom of expression, but not looking at the right to non-discrimination, then that analysis isn't going to be necessarily as helpful, I would argue. But I think essentially, when you look at human rights and human-centered design, it prompts you to think about all of the different ways that human rights can be violated and can be abused. And ideally, the way that you would do this is by thinking through all of the different inequalities that exist offline and seeing how those can manifest and permeate in the online spaces. And so this is something that was very central to the research that I did while I was at Amnesty International, which was looking at online abuse against women. And if I had just looked at that topic without looking at the wider inequalities that happen offline and without considering the various forms of discrimination against marginalized communities, I think it would have been a very different research report. But once you consider all of those inequalities, once you consider non-discrimination, once you consider that not everyone has the same lived reality, and every product that we build, every policy that we make has implications on how people's rights are respected, then you, I think, at the end of those considerations, you're able to come to a much stronger product or policy decision when you're building technology.
Yeah, it's such an important point about taking into account the offline social inequalities and not thinking that the internet's some kind of separate space, and recognizing the ways that it amplifies what's already there.
Absolutely. I don't think anything that we're seeing in terms of the sort of negative ways that technology has impacted human rights. And I say that because I think it's really important to also acknowledge all the positive ways that it's impacted human rights as well, in terms of amplifying the right not the right voices, but the ability for people to speak freely online and amplifying the voices of marginalized communities that maybe not have had sort of those platforms before. But at the same time, there are also negative consequences of that as well. And so I think as long as we're able to sort of look at everything sort of holistically and bring in all voices, that's really, really important. And it's also really important to ensure that we have a gender and diversity in terms of everyone that we're speaking to, but also in terms of who's making those decisions, who's around the table. If you're building a product and you only have people that look like you or sound like you around that table, and you're not speaking to the right groups, you're going to be missing out on a plethora of experiences and voices and opinions that should be considered.
Do you think that technology companies get that relationship between human rights and the actual equality and diversity within their teams?
I think they're getting better at acknowledging that it's important. I do personally think that if there had been greater diversity and inclusion in these technology companies, and when I say technology companies, I'm specifically talking about the really big social media platforms right now, when they were building their products and coming up with their policies, if there had been greater gender and diversity in terms of who is around the table when they're thinking through product and policy decisions, some of the sort of effects that we've seen, the negative effects and the harmful impacts may not have happened or would have been addressed much more quickly because they would have been raised a lot earlier. So, I do see technology companies and the big platforms taking human rights a lot more seriously. A lot of them are, hiring human rights managers or officers to make sure that their companies are abiding by human rights and respecting human rights and looking at the risks and mitigation strategies, which I think is a really, really positive step. And I think I just think, a lot of these companies are struggling as well in terms of regulation and how to, respect rights, but also, promote freedom of expression, which is a right, but, and how to balance that when harmful sort of content is happening on their platform. And like I said, the human rights framework provides a handy framework for them. So I think they themselves are realizing that it helps to embrace this framework because it can help them and it gives them guidance. And there's a lot of human rights experts doing some really important thinking around this matter.
Yeah, totally. Also, just in terms of a sort of shameless plug for the course, I do really hope that those types of roles become more common and that the graduates from this program will be able to fill them and do a really good job. And I think that we are seeing a bit more of an understanding that you need new types of job families and functions within organizations, big technology
Absolutely.
companies. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So a lot of your work has centered around online abuse. Can you talk to us a bit about what rights are violated in the case of online abuse and how you've used a human rights framework to tackle the problem?
Yeah, sure. So when I started looking at this topic, which was about 4 years ago now, so it wasn't necessarily as mainstream. I think a lot more people recognize and understand the harmful impact of online abuse and how prevalent it is in society. But about 4 years ago, when I started looking into it, most of the sort of evidence that was out there of online abuse was very anecdotal, and it was mainly by female journalists in the US. And I noticed that the voices and the experiences of abuse that were out there in the media were pretty singular in the sense that it was mainly white female journalists, and also that what was happening to them and their really horrific experiences of violence and abuse were not being framed as a human rights abuse or human rights violation. It was being framed as this really horrible thing that's happened to me because I'm a journalist and I'm speaking freely about issues such as, feminism or anti-racism. And what I really wanted to do was use my role at Amnesty and my human rights expertise and look at how online abuse, has harmful human rights impacts. And so I did this by looking at how the impact of online abuse contributes to, the right, can deny the right to freedom of expression, the right to non-discrimination, the right to equality, the right to privacy. So when you look at all of these different online abuses and their tactics, so for example, you have uploading private and intimate images of someone without their consent. That's a privacy violation. When you look at when someone sends you a threat of violence, that's a violation of your right to live free from violence. When you look at, the sort of plethora of racist abuse that exists, unfortunately, on social media platforms, that's often targeted at, targeted at marginalized communities, that's against the right to non-discrimination. So I think if you are able to look at the human rights framework and start actually seeing how all of those different experiences of online abuse are actually human rights abuses as well, then again, it provides us that framework to hold technology companies and government accountable for what the solutions and recommendations and responses are. And for me, that was really important because what I noticed really quickly was as soon as I started speaking to, and I focus on the gender-based experience of online abuse, and that's not to say that not all genders obviously experience online abuse, but women in particular experience a very gendered form of abuse. So, the threats against them are very sexual in nature. The comments and sort of abuse they get is very, it'll target their appearance or make references to their body or reinforce sort of harmful gender stereotypes against women. And I very quickly noticed that once I started speaking to a diversity of women from all sort of, races and ethnicities, women with living with disabilities, LGBTI women, non-binary people as well, that their experiences of abuse online very much intersected with all of their different identities. So, Black women were not just getting, sexist abuse, they were getting bombarded with racist abuse as well. If you're a lesbian woman, you were receiving homophobic abuse as in addition to the sexist abuse that you were receiving. And I think it's really important to look at that because you then realize that if you are someone from a marginalized identity, that your risk of abuse and the way that you're being targeted is increases because you hold those different identities. So any response by governments, by technology companies needs to take that into consideration. If you just have a blanket approach to, we will not allow violent threats on our platform, for example, okay, that's good. That's respecting the right to live free from violence. But also, what about all of the sort of racist, sexist epithets that are, taking place on the platform? How are you dealing with that? Whose voices are being amplified? Whose voices are being silenced? And so, thinking about the research in that way really helped, I think. I hope sort of come up with a report that really highlighted the diversity of views and opinions and some really valid solutions on how to address that.
Thanks. Yeah, it's encouraging to feel that understanding this framework can help with developing nuanced solutions that do take into account those different experiences.
Absolutely.
I wanted to ask you about the role of platforms in protecting human rights. So it often feels like perhaps they don't curb hate speech or inappropriate behavior as much as they should, because it actually drives traffic and attention for them. Do you think that's the case? What kind of demands should we be making on platforms to be more responsible?
Yeah, I think there's obviously a sort of financial gain from perhaps not addressing all forms of abuse on the platform. If you're, these platforms are trying to make money, and a lot of them are, their stock value is assessed by the number of, monthly average users or daily average users they have. So if they start addressing the true scale and nature of abuse on their platforms, it means probably getting rid of a lot of accounts that are maybe fake or bots, or breaking their rules. And there's a whole sort of background. There's a lot of information and literature out there about the sort of the incentive for platforms not to necessarily take down abuse. But that being said, I think that there has been much more of an effort recently to ensure that their policies are more reflective of the types of harmful content that permeates on their platforms. I think what's still missing, however, is more transparency on content moderation and how platforms are actually responding to reports of abuse. There's a lot more that needs to be known in terms of disaggregated data. So what types of reports are being made? How quickly are they taking them down? How many of those reports are, in violation of the community standards? Which community standards are reported more than others? How are their content moderators being trained, not just on their own community standards, but on human rights? So, they have taken some steps, and we've seen social media platforms take greater initiative in terms of being more transparent. But I still think that there's a lot more that they need to do to build user trust and user safety, and sort of ensure that everyday users know that when they use their platforms, if they experience an online harm, that there is something that they can do to report that, and to ensure that that platform takes care of them, in the sense of, if I report online abuse against me, I would want to know at minimum that the company is going to consider my report and take the appropriate action if needed, and let me know the action that they've taken and why. And I think sometimes that's missing. You still hear lots of people saying, I reported something on Twitter or on Facebook, and it sort of gone into a black hole, and they never hear back. So I think that's still lacking.
And do you think there is a growing willingness to try to improve policies? Do you think there's an appetite for it?
Yeah, I think there's definitely an appetite for it. Like I said, I've seen a lot more social media companies sort of hiring sort of human rights experts and other public policy experts about different forms of online harm that can occur. But I think I personally think that it's really important that it's not just policy folks that are considering human rights. I think that's really important for everyone working on technology to consider human rights, because I can write all the policies that I need, but if new products are being rolled out within a certain app or within a certain platform, and those products aren't being considered in terms of their human rights impact, and you don't have the experts and those with the expertise to consider the human rights impact, then there's sort of a disconnect, and then you're sort of trying to catch up with the policy. And I think really it needs to be mainstreamed and ingrained, and it's because a lot of the people that are building technology, fortunately / unfortunately, don't ever experience the negative impact of that technology on themselves, right? So a lot of the people that built Twitter, it seems, they don't really engage in like public communications and conversations. It's much more like a broadcasting feature for them. But if you're using Twitter in sort of the true sense of how it's meant to be built, meant to be used, where you're having conversations with other people that you don't know, and voicing your opinions and expressions, it can very quickly spiral out of control and sort of lead to tantamount to online abuse. And if you don't have that experience, then how are you going to know how to come up with a solution for it? So.
Right, exactly, which comes back to the point about lived experience and trying to sort of narrow the gap between the designers of technologies and the experiences of all the different people that are using it.
Yeah, absolutely.
In terms of content moderation, it strikes me that there's lots of human rights that need to be protected for the content moderators themselves, and that perhaps doesn't always happen. Yeah, have you come across many stories around that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a really fabulous journalist named Casey Newton, and he's done loads and loads of really good work on exposing the sort of psychological trauma that's associated with being a content moderator. I can speak personally from my own experience as someone that spent almost 2 years looking at abusive and violent content on Twitter, particularly against women and particularly against women of color. It's really distressing to see the most horrific side of society in sort of plain English and on your screen all the time. And it's really important that, I think the need for human content moderators is very important, because there's a lot of, when we're trying to maintain freedom of expression, the last thing that we want is to, unlawfully take down content that is someone freely expressing themselves, because, it's important to remember that freedom of expression also includes content that's like offensive or shocking. But, so if you're just using, like, for example, artificial intelligence or algorithms without any transparency, there's a really high risk of taking down that content. So that's why human content moderation is really important. So, because humans will understand that context. At the same time, that means that you're asking humans to look at potentially extremely violent and distressing and graphic content. And there really needs to be just a model of self-care and sort of just and sort of companies providing services, mental health services and breaks, and just something to make sure that the mental health of the people that are doing that job and essentially keeping these platforms safe for us are not only compensated adequately and fairly, but that their mental health doesn't deteriorate as a result. And I think there are definitely ways and models of doing that, but it doesn't seem like the social media companies have really prioritized the mental health of the people that are reviewing this content for us.
Thank you so much. So I just want to pick up on something you just mentioned around this tension, because I think it's one of the thorniest issues and the hardest to sort of wrap your head around, is the tension between protecting free speech and protecting human rights. And I just wondered where you've seen the best sort of balance or approach to that massive challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where the human rights framework really comes in, because the right to freedom of expression obviously is a fundamental human right, but it can be restricted under certain sort of circumstances. So if it's necessary, legitimate, proportionate, and legal and by law, then your right to expression it can be restricted, basically. And I think this is where it's really important to look at how human rights and the right to free expression offline, and the sort of the tests that have been provided in human rights frameworks can be applied online. And I think it's very difficult. It's still a tricky subject. I've been looking at this issue for a few years. I personally think that it's very, very important to think about not just the person who has the right to say something, but the impact on freedom of expression of the person that's being said to. And I say this because marginalized communities in particular, which I mentioned before, who are at the receiving end of disproportionate amounts of abuse. The research that I did and loads of other researchers found that when you experience online abuse or when you receive online abuse, one of the reactions, one of the impacts of that is people will silence and censor themselves as a result, and their freedom of expression is then being denied. And it's important to look at both sides of what's being said and who it's being said to, and how that impacts the right to free expression. So, you know, I think it's really important to, and this is where having strong policies about the content that's allowed and not allowed on platforms is really important, and it's really important for them to, those policies to also respect human rights. So I think, you know, they all sort of play into each other, but I definitely think that there's lots of really difficult decisions out there that need to be considered. And I think, again, this is where having those conversations with a diversity of people and diversity of views is really, really important, because it's really important that any of these decisions, because the companies that are making these decisions have enormous impact, right, on how we communicate online. And even though these are private companies, essentially they're public squares where people are talking to each other and shouting at each other sometimes. But you know, it's a space where a lot of our communication and interactions happen. So any approach that they take has to ensure that the right to freedom of expression is respected, but for all users equally, so that you know, any policies, any product decisions respect the right to speak equally and freely and safely online. I shouldn't have to fear online abuse or getting death threats if I want to express something that I on Twitter or on Facebook or on Instagram later today. I should be able to do that safely. And at the moment, I think that all of the platforms still have some work to do on that.
Right, agreed. I wonder if you have any thoughts around the role of users as well in keeping platforms safe. I'm thinking specifically about how difficult it is to understand the motivations for the abuse, and perhaps it's not possible to always reach out to trolls or harassers and understand or communicate about why it's happening, but in some cases it might be possible. And also, I guess there's a sort of responsibility to understand the consequences of even sharing content or amplifying certain content, for example, without a trigger warning or something like that. So yeah, I just wondered about how you see the users in this.
I think I would definitely signpost everyone to the really great work that's being done by Glitch and Shay Yakiwawa's organization around digital citizenship. One of the sort of core components of the work that they do is all about how to promote digital citizenship and ensure that all online users understand how to use the internet safely, how to be responsible digital citizens. And it's not just the users, it's also, you know, governments and companies that obviously have a role to ensure that digital citizenship is maintained and respected and applied. But I think it's really important, because if users are going online and they don't necessarily understand the policies of the platforms, how to respectfully communicate online, the consequences of their actions online, then, you know, that sort of the sort of unsafe feeling in these online environments will just will stay the same. So I think it's really important that everyone, you know, just as we're citizens in the offline world, it's really important that we are good citizens online and we treat each other with respect and equality. And I think, you know, it's also really important to ensure that you are helping others online that you may see being attacked or abused, and, you know, intervening in a safe and in a positive way, whether that's by reporting the abuse that someone else might be experiencing, or, you know, just amplifying marginalized voices. I think it's just really important that we think about individual responsibility as well, in terms of how we create a safe and healthy internet and online experience for everybody.
Thank you. Okay, so just one final question. Imagining that the students on this course are going to be potential human rights officers in technology companies in the future, I was just wondering, is there anything that you would really hope that they'd be asking themselves as they go through this course? Questions that perhaps you've asked yourself in your own research, or you think have been really great for designers or technologists to ask themselves in their own work?
I think that it's really important to consider human rights, not in just all of the policy decisions that technology and technology companies are making, but as I said earlier, in the product decisions. And I think that, especially in the space of online abuse, there's a lot of interesting policy work that's being done, a lot of thinking, like, I've been talking about in terms of how to respect the human rights framework and online content moderation, for example. However, I think it's really important to think of like innovative and creative solutions in terms of the products that can be built and the sort of product decisions that are made and how those can help respect human rights. And I think that's something that's still sort of lacking in terms of creative ways to address some of the online harms that we're seeing online and really explicitly bringing human rights and the respect of human rights into those into the creation of those initiatives and the application of those initiatives. And I just really think that, I'm just reiterating myself, but I really think that whatever they're creating or whatever they're doing, just, please talk to everyone that you possibly can from a diversity of different opinions and views to ensure that the product that you're building or the software that you're considering of building all encompasses the different viewpoints and different experiences, because otherwise, what I don't want to see is the people from this course coming into this course with very well-meaning intentions, but perpetuating the same sort of ideologies that we've seen in the past, where only a few people are considered and they think the product's really great, and then in the aftermath they see that, oh, actually it's not that great for everybody. And I think it's really important that we start thinking about these human rights and the respect for it and every decision that we're taking and making from the onset and not as an afterthought.
Thank you so much, Azmina. That's been really, really enlightening and very, very helpful. So thank you so much for your time. Really, really appreciate it.
No problem.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks. So I'm just going to say a few quick things to anyone who is thinking about applying for this course. Firstly, CCI is working to create and maintain a diverse and inclusive community. We welcome applications from people of all identities. Anyone who can demonstrate critical knowledge of or enthusiasm for this subject, we really welcome you to apply. And the most important thing is give us a rationale for why you want to take part. And there's no coding skills required to take part in this course, even though we're a creative computing institute. So I wanted to share that. We also do recognise that financing postgraduate education can be really challenging. There are some avenues for means-tested financial support. There are some small bursaries which we can advise on if you email us. So you can apply by visiting the link in this chat below, and you can email CCI as well if you have any questions about the course. And the next talk in this series will be on Friday, and I'll be talking to Dr. Irene Tacchini Fabara-Manuel about computational inequality. So hope to see you online, and thank you so much for listening.